Agora teremos uma sessão que já virou uma tradição no Fórum, que se chama Em Conversa Com. Para essa sessão, convido ao palco Sonali Patel, sócia da Bridgespan. E para moderar esse bate-papo, que vai ser super interessante, chamo Paula Fabiani, CEO do IDIS.
So, Sonali, thank you very much for being with us. It's really an honor to have you here. I think Bridgespan became very famous in Brazil with the donation of Mackenzie Scott to 16 Brazilian organizations. And actually, because this donation was unrestricted and a significant amount, something that we don't see much in the Brazilian philanthropic sector. So I know that relationships with your clients are confidential. We talked a lot about that. But this multi-year, non-restrictive funding is something that is, I think, something very important for the development of the social sector. And we're going to explore a little bit of that. But before we get to that, I really wanted for you to share a little bit of your story. We want to know who is Sonali Patel. Why did you move into the sector? So why don't we start with you introducing yourself, telling a little bit about your life and why you decided to dedicate to the philanthropic field.
Great. Thank you for having me, Paula. This has been amazing. And thank you to all the speakers so far. I feel like I've learned so much about the Brazilian philanthropic market. So this has been a great day for me, and I've done a lot of learning. I could tell everyone a little bit about myself. Sonali Patel, I'm a partner at the Bridgespan Group. I co-lead our climate area of expertise as well as our global sourcing and diligence. And so that's the role I play at Bridgespan. I'm in the New York office, but Bridgespan, just so you all know, is a global firm. We have 3 offices in the US, but we also have offices in Mumbai, in Johannesburg, and in Singapore, and from Singapore we serve Southeast Asia. So a little bit about myself. I was at Bain & Company, which is a for-profit consulting firm for about a decade before I came to Bridgespan. I loved consulting. Bain was a fantastic organization. I had my 3 children while I was at Bain. And Bain was really generous and wonderful. I worked part-time after I had my first child. But after I'd had all 3, I realized that I wanted to do something that I found really meaningful when I was leaving my kids every day for work. And growing up, I had always gone back to India for 3 months every summer. And the difference between growing up in the United States and growing up in India, where poverty is much more visible, is something that had always stuck with me. And so at the time when I joined Bridgespan, they were starting the Mumbai office. And so I was able to help work on that piece of Bridgespan. Our first client was the Tata Trust, and I was flying back to India about a week every month, working on the Tata Trust for about 9 months. And through some of those initial client relationships, we were able to get an office up and running. So it felt like the right moment and the right time for me to make the move from the for-profit sector to the nonprofit sector. Since then, I've been at Bridgespan for 9 years, I think 9 or 10 years at this point.
Since the founding?
No, so Bridgespan was actually founded about 22 years ago. We were founded in 2000. It was Bain Partners who actually came over and founded Bridgespan. And Bridgespan started in the US. And it has done work in the US up until that point, which I moved over in 2013, which was when we opened our first global offices. And for those of you, I'm sure most people are not familiar with Bridgespan. I can give you a little bit of knowledge about what Bridgespan does. So we have 3 kind of primary activities that we participate in. One is our advisory services, which is where I spend most of my time. And Bridgespan is a 501c3. So in our advisory services, what we do is we serve both funders, and that can be individuals or foundations, as well as nonprofits. And we try to keep a 50-50 mix of advisory services between funders and nonprofits. And we work with them on all sorts of issues. It could be strategy, organizational design, fundraising strategy for nonprofits, a wide range. And we charge at cost because we're a nonprofit. So we charge exactly at cost for the team to be able to recoup the money for our staff and our services. The second piece of our work is something called the Institute, and that's grant funded. And there what we do is we do research for the social sector. And a lot of the ideas that come into the Institute come from our work with either nonprofits or with funders. And those ideas come into the Institute and we publish based on those ideas. Sometimes we publish with partners, sometimes we publish on our own. And that work, really we have a few multi-year initiatives. Some are around racial equity, impact investing. I'm currently working on some work in the Institute that's focused on climate that just really help with the sector growth. And then the third part of the work we do is not all nonprofits are large enough to be able to afford bridge span advisory services. So we work in specific cities, and in those cities, we have a program called Leading for Impact. And 2 or 3 funders within the city will actually fund about 75% of the program, and then nonprofits pay a nominal fee to join. And we work in that city over a series of years, and we go in cohorts of 50, nonprofits will join, and in that cohort, we do training on all of the major pieces, strategy, executive functioning, all the major pieces of being a really successful organization to build the organization's capacity. And they also bring some strategic problems that they're thinking about, and we support them in how to think about those problems and how to come to effective solutions.
Very interesting. Actually, IDIS also does consulting. We have what we call impact projects, which is similar to one of the initiatives you have, and the knowledge generation, publishing, research, this event, and very, very similar story. And in your journey helping families all over the globe, have you seen any changes in the motivations that drive families? And also business. I know sometimes you also work with some businesses.
We primarily work with individuals and foundations.
So individuals and foundations in their philanthropic practice. And how do you evaluate the relationship between donors and the beneficiary organizations?
So every donor thinks about the way in which they do their grant making differently. And we do think philanthropy is a very personalized experience. So when we work with donors, we really try to understand what's motivating them, what they're most interested in, and then support them in their journey to give philanthropically along those dimensions. And so we will find that the diligence process for a variety of different donors looks very different because they're optimizing for different things within their diligence process.
But do you have, how can I say, a model for this due diligence, like the light, the strong, the medium? It depends on the donor.
It really depends on the donor. I mean, there are things that every donor pays attention to, like track record of impact. And so we'll think deeply about that, and we have ways in which we assess outputs, outcomes, where the organization is in their life cycle, and what we would expect at that point. But then there are also things that different donors care about differently. So some donors are very focused on equity, and it could be a specific dimension of equity, gender equity, racial equity, caste equity if we're working in India. And so there are very different dimensions to what the donor really wants to zone in on. And we will work with the donor to create a diligence process that actually brings that to life and brings to life what the organization is doing that's really unique within that sphere. The one other thing that we've seen lately is a real move to unrestricted funding. And it's early to say if that is going to last, but during COVID, what we saw was 800 institutional funders signed a pledge that they were going to move to unrestricted funding to help organizations during COVID. Now, many of them have said since then that it has been successful and they hope to continue in that vein. But it's still too early to tell. We're all just coming out of COVID. But we're hopeful to see this move towards more trust-based philanthropy as we see more and more institutional and individual philanthropists engaging in trust-based philanthropy.
That's very interesting. I think trust has been a word of much interest in the last couple of years. And have to ask a little bit, I know you cannot be public about the history of Mackenzie Scott Giving, but how about tell us a little bit about the methodology that you use and your selection criteria, just in general, so that we can learn a little bit how you think of the choosing projects in different countries. Because, I mean, it's the first time that I've seen Bridgespan working in Brazil. Maybe you've done before, but it was not publicized. But how do you look into, what are the methods? You talk a little bit about that already when you talk about how you also the level of due diligence that each of the donor they choose, but just a little bit about the methodologies that Bridgespan applies and uses in their selection process.
So I'll start just by saying I can't share anything about Mackenzie Scott. Each of our clients is confidential, and we really can't share anything about the way in which they approach their work. But what I can talk about is, as the head of global sourcing and diligence, I work with a wide variety of philanthropists that are all focused on the global south and really thinking about giving in the global south. And the way they approach that work is some have specific regions that they're very, very interested in. So some will say, you know, I'm really interested in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where I want to think about my giving. And then we will work closely with our team that is on the ground to be able to enable that work. Some it'll be India, some it'll be a specific country, and others really are interested in giving across the global south, and are asking us for ways in which they can be most efficient in that giving. One of the things that we've seen increasingly from the U.S. to the global south is desire to be more proximate in the giving. So there are a lot of organizations that are headquartered in the U.S. and then have arms all around the globe. But a lot of the philanthropists we work with are now much more interested in thinking about giving to local organizations or local individuals.
Yeah, the localization is a trend.
Yeah. And there are a couple of methodologies for that. There are some difficulties in giving from the U.S. to the global south. One is you need an equivalency determination, which means the organization has to go through a process by which they can legally accept the funds. But there are vehicles that are helpful in being able to do very local proximate sourcing and giving from the U.S. Some are funds, and funds are actually organizations that collect funding, and then they actually do the diligence to understand the real local issues and where the money should go. And foreign donors can give there quite easily, and it disperses. And I think you have someone who's going to speak about that later today, Africa Visionary Fund, which will be exciting. Other things are we try and get as proximate as we can by talking to local sources about what they're doing and how they're giving. And that oftentimes is a really helpful way for us to think about how we can do sourcing and diligence at a more proximate level. But it is an interesting shift, and many more donors are thinking about where they can go in the global south.
That's very interesting. And what about scale? I mean, maybe you have also some examples to share with us about scalable solutions, and also how some donors are investing in generating structural transformations. How do you see this search for scale? But you also see some donors looking into specific transformations that they want to see in societies?
I think that's a really good question, and that's one of the places where I actually think the global north can learn a tremendous amount from the global south. So one of the things that the global south does exceptionally well is they think about how to prove a model and scale through partnerships, and oftentimes partnership with government.
Yeah, I would love to hear also your views on collaboration in these processes, because collaboration is the theme of our forum, and I think achieving scalable solutions, it's required that you partner and that you collaborate with others.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things we look at a lot when we're looking at diligence of any organization for any donor, is what is the path to scale? And you want to support local organizations that are doing great work that can create the model for impact. and then support them in thinking about who the right partners are, whether it's at the local level, the state level, the federal level, to actually scale their work more broadly. And you also see nonprofits that are scaling globally. So Pratham found a model that works, teaching at the right level. They then brought that to South Africa, where they found that they could actually export key tenets of the model, shift it a little bit, and it would work in a different setting. And my understanding is that it's now coming to Brazil as well. And so you will see there's even global scale of thinking about, if you learn something that works really effectively in one country, are there opportunities to spread those learnings across the globe?
And evaluation, how do you see, have your clients required, how have they required for impact to be measured? What are your views on impact evaluation?
So I think impact evaluation has to look different depending on the type of organization that you're working with. There is no methodology that works for everybody. And so we try to be very flexible in the way in which we think about outcomes. If we're working with an organization that does primarily advocacy, it could take 20 years before a law is changed that you can truly call, you know, here it is, here's the impact we had. And most of the work that they're doing, it's not a direct line to the end outcome. So being very deliberate about thinking about what type of organization it is, what the end outcome is that they want to achieve, and what are the interim metrics that you can measure that show that the interventions are working. Now, some things in direct service, that's fairly easy. We're in a village, we're teaching kids, the literacy rate went from X to Y. Other things are very difficult to measure, and so you need to have both patience and adapt the methodology that you're using to the specific situation of the organization.
And before we turn into our audience for questions, I just wanted to see, how do you see possible collaborations in our sector?
Yeah.
What do you see is possible, and do you have any examples from your experience that you think that could be applied here in Brazil?
Yeah, so funding collaboratives is actually
Funding together, so.
funding, yeah, philanthropists funding together in collaboratives. We've seen, Bridgespan research has shown that 75% of the collaboratives have come about since 2010, and 50% of those since 2015. So it's relatively new for philanthropists to collaborate together. But we see a lot of impact in this work for a few reasons. One is for the donors, they can be more efficient. Shared sourcing and diligence, interested in the same areas, enables people to be very efficient in finding great opportunities. They can be more effective. They can bring in research experts, proximate leaders to help inform their giving, and they're doing it with others. And then the other thing we found is it's actually more engagement, it's more enjoyment, because collaborating with others and going on a journey with people, like-minded people, actually creates great discussions, great conversation, and philanthropists really enjoy that. And one of the things we've also found is this is tended towards more proximate giving, more trust-based giving, because there's more time, there's more discussion to actually create those avenues through collaborations. And so some of the collaborations we work with are Audacious, Co-Impact we've worked with in the past, Climate Works we've worked with in the past, all of them doing really, really great work in terms of bringing funders together to be able to create impact.
So I'd like to open for the audience, and I know that we have an audience online, so they can share their questions on the chat. And whoever wants to make a question, please raise your hand in the back, and then we're going to have someone bringing the microphone. There it is. And we have a question here on the front. So maybe we're going to take both questions, and then you can answer. I think it's going to be work better.
Tudo bem?
You can ask in Portuguese. Sonali has the translation set.
Ok. Tudo bem? A minha pergunta é a seguinte: como que a Bridgespan pode ajudar os doadores, os grandes doadores, a verem mais as causas urgentes nas diferentes regiões? Isso eu quero dizer o seguinte: para além do que está alinhado com aquilo que eles querem doar, com as causas que eles querem doar, como que a Bridgespan pode ajudá-los a enxergar questões urgentes das diferentes regiões. Tudo isso para dizer que, quando a gente viu a doação, eu sei que você não pode falar, da Mackenzie, por meio da Bridgespan, isso trouxe um certo interesse de organizações locais que têm uma atuação muito forte em questões muito urgentes, em quererem se conectar com empresas como a Bridgespan, para estar no portfólio da Bridgespan, para quando aparecer um grande doador, que ele saiba que aquela organização existe, que ela é transparente, que ela tem todos os relatórios de impacto. Então, essa é a minha pergunta. Para além daqueles doadores que você já tem no seu portfólio, que você já sabe quais são as causas que eles doam, qual é o caminho inverso, né? Seria quase um bottoms-up, sabe? A partir da Bridgespan, para falar, olha para essa causa também. Se você está doando para essa, olha para essa, olha para essa parte do mundo. Então, acho que isso talvez responda muito do que eu ouvi quando eu vi na mídia a Bridgespan. Eu confesso que eu não conhecia o escritório de vocês e mandei um e-mail, inclusive, para o escritório de vocês e falei, olha, a gente existe, gostaria de estar no portfólio de vocês, mas queria ouvir de vocês. Qual é a tua visão desse ponto de vista?
Vou pegar mais uma pergunta. A question here, aqui. E aí, and then we're going to take two, and then we pass to you, okay? Or do you prefer to answer the first one? Okay.
Oh, there. Thank you. One question: how much are you using systemic approaches that really drills into the purpose of the donor and the indicators based on that purpose to really find the systemic change and capacity and that? That would be my question.
Great. So I'll start with answering the question in the back. I want to be clear. Bridgespan is not, we do not direct funding. We are advisors who support philanthropists in the journey that they hope to take. And that is truly the way we think of ourselves. And our role is never to say something is right, wrong, black, white, ugly, whatever you want to call it. Our role is to support someone in a journey and give them guidance on the way in which we think they could be most effective in the journey that they want to take. And so that's the way we think of our work. Now, if someone wants to get involved in a certain country, we will support them in that. We will do our best to get to know that market, get to know the organizations within that market, and try and take the lens of any philanthropic donor and what they are thinking about in that moment and apply that in that country. That is true also for issue areas, right? I have a donor that I worked with in climate for a long time, and when he started, he was testing the market of climate, and he was like, I have $10 million, I want to spread it out against a bunch of different types of interventions, some in technology, some in policy, some in climate justice, kind of across the board, and I want to see where there are real white spaces, and then I can go further. And the white space he found that he was most interested in was carbon direct capture in the ocean, because it's an underfunded area. And within that, specifically, ocean alkalinity enhancement. And he wants to do the research to see if something actually exists there, because it's an underfunded white space. But we didn't direct him to any one area. We gave him all the options, and he found the one that most resonated with him. And that's the way in which we think about our work, which is we are advisors, and we will support philanthropists, and we will talk about the things that we think are really important, like equity, like proximate giving. But it is, in the end of the day, we're in a journey with someone and not directing funding flows. And then to your question up here, I definitely believe in systems change, and Bridgespan thinks about it a lot. And it depends on who we're working for. Rockefeller Foundation thinks about systems change a lot. And so when we're working with them, that's one of the things that we think about a lot in our strategy work. And I think we also in our institute think a lot about how you create systemic change as opposed to kind of drops in the bucket and what is actually creating that systemic change. I think systems change is really, really hard. And I don't have any solution for it. But what I can say is it is a way in which we think, and it's something that we are always striving for to actually change the system. I don't know that we can say, or anyone can say, that we've actually 100% achieved it. But I agree with you. It's a really important way in which to think about philanthropy.
So is there any other question? Here? Okay.
Olá, vou falar em português. Meu nome é Daniela, eu sou consultora também na área de filantropia. E eu queria, na verdade, fazer uma pergunta ligada ao tema da transparência e da confidencialidade, principalmente relacionado ao processo da Mackenzie Scott, mas também em relação a outros clientes, né? Você acabou de dizer para a gente, olha, a gente não pode falar muito. E aí eu entendo que no campo dos valores que estão sendo doados, isso é muito comum. Mas aqui no Brasil, assim, a gente ficou, primeiro, muito grato, muito feliz por todo o apoio que essas organizações apoiadas pela Mackenzie Scott receberam. E mais curiosos ainda por conta do fato de ser um funding irrestrito, né? E que exige, provavelmente, um grau de confiança muito grande, que se apoia num processo de diligência provavelmente excelente, né? E quando a gente conversou com as organizações, a gente ouvia, olha, a gente não pode falar muito. Durante o processo, a gente não sabia muito também, a gente fez muita coisa no escuro. E aí a gente aqui defende muito a transparência. Opa, parou de funcionar. Fui censurada. Alô? Será? Voltou. A gente fala muito sobre compartilhar conhecimento, trabalhar com uma lógica de código aberto, fazer investimento de forma colaborativa. E aí, para mim, isso gera uma contradição, né, daquilo que a gente busca. Assim. Então, eu queria entender o porquê da necessidade de tanto cuidado com essa confidencialidade, até onde ela, de fato, vai, o porquê das organizações terem que se submeter a um processo sem ter tanta informação sobre o outro lado, né? Enfim, de fato, uma curiosidade, assim, não é tanto uma crítica, porque eu imagino que vocês devem ter bons motivos para isso, mas queria entender o porquê.
So I can't speak for anyone, any one donor or any group of donors about the way in which they approach their philanthropy. I do think if you're interested in what Mackenzie Scott has done, she puts out Medium posts on a regular basis, which speaks to what she's done during that time period and why she's done it. But it is not it certainly isn't my place to have an opinion on how someone does their giving. And the one thing I will say is I think people have different ways in which they do their giving, and people have different ways in which they're thinking about their giving, and they share what is comfortable to them with the globe. And that, I think, is their prerogative in the way in which they do their giving. And some of our donors are okay to be mentioned, and some aren't. And we respect the way in which they want to work with us when we do our work.
Thank you, Sonali. I think I would like to hear your final comments. Thank you very, very, very much for being with us. It was wonderful to have you with us the whole day and for us to have met in the last days. And also, I hope you take some of your journey here in Brazil back to the US, back to your donors, and I hope to see you again soon. But before we end this session, I would like to hear final thoughts, maybe touching a little bit on collaboration, which is the topic of our forum.
Well, no, thank you for having me, and it's exciting to hear about what is happening here. And I think there's huge opportunity for collaboration in Brazil between funders, with funders and nonprofits, with companies and funders, and it sounds like maybe even with governments. But I think the opportunities for collaboration are really big, and I hope to see more of it happening in Brazil, and I'm really excited to see what happens in this market as you move forward. But thank you for having me, and this was great. It was really interesting.
Thank you very much.